And just as a quick side note, please put your questions in the Q&A down at the very bottom, for which we will be conducting a Q&A session right after the next speaker. Laura, the floor is yours, and we're looking forward to hearing. Thank you.
Thanks, Tyson. So first, I just want to say thanks to Will for inviting me today and to the Wayne Law Review for organizing this panel on the laws of the pandemic. So I am Laura Stanley. I am a senior policy analyst at the George Washington Regulatory Studies Center. And today I am going to talk about a report that my colleague, Professor Bridget Dooling, and I recently put out that discusses the legal options available for extending COVID-19 flexibilities that were granted for treating opioid use disorder. So as you all know, the COVID-19 pandemic transformed our lives and our public policies almost overnight. In response to the need to socially distance, federal regulatory agencies dramatically reduced barriers to using telemedicine to treat opioid use disorder. So I'm going to talk specifically about one flexibility that allowed practitioners to initiate buprenorphine treatment using telemedicine. So if you're not familiar with buprenorphine, it's a medication that alleviates some of the withdrawal symptoms associated with discontinuing opioid use. And it's one of the medications that's considered the gold standard for treating opioid use disorder, up there with methadone. So this is just a little bit of a roadmap of what I am going to talk about. First, I'll talk a little bit about buprenorphine and its importance and some of the challenges that patients face in accessing the medication. Then I'll talk a little bit about the existing regulations for initiating buprenorphine treatment, the flexibilities granted during the pandemic, and then I'll talk about 3 approaches that federal agencies have to extending these flexibilities after the COVID-19 public health emergency is over. All right, so as I mentioned, buprenorphine is one of the medications that is highly effective in treating opioid use disorder. So it reduces illicit opioid use, it increases patient retention and treatment programs, and as a result of all of that, it reduces overdoses. But it's actually incredibly challenging for patients to access buprenorphine sometimes. So practitioners who want to treat patients with buprenorphine face numerous regulatory hurdles, and I'll talk about those a little more in a minute. But this limits the number of practitioners who are available to treat patients with buprenorphine. So if patients are lucky enough to find a practitioner who can treat them, they still face a lot of logistical hurdles. So for example, many patients live in rural areas or underserved urban areas, and they have to travel significant distances to access treatment. Is the next slide showing up for you?
I think that I'm having an issue with the graphic. If you keep talking, I'll try to pull up the graphic.
Okay, sounds good. So this slide, I just had a map of Wyoming County, West Virginia, and it's not like absolutely critical. Will that you pull it up? But I wanted to use this example from West Virginia to just highlight how serious the barriers are for patients who want to access buprenorphine. West Virginia is where my family is from, so it really hits close to home. So the map highlighted Wyoming County in West Virginia, and it has been hit particularly hard by the opioid epidemic. So in the 3rd week of March 2020, in the early part of the pandemic, there were 14 opioid overdose calls in that week alone. And that's not unusual in this county. So historically, Wyoming County has had one of the highest overdose death rates in the country. As of a few years ago, Wyoming County did not have a single practitioner who was permitted to prescribe buprenorphine to patients. This meant patients had to travel significant distances to find a practitioner to initiate treatment. And those long travel distances really make a big difference. So studies have shown that longer travel distances make it less likely that patients with substance use disorder will obtain and stay in treatment. So Will, if you want to pull up the original slide deck and go to, yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. All right, so I mentioned that practitioners who want to treat patients with buprenorphine face regulatory hurdles, and I'll expand on that a little bit here. So practitioners only have 2 options if they want to treat patients with buprenorphine, specifically for the purpose of treating them for opioid use disorder. So first, A practitioner can complete a special training and obtain a waiver from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And throughout the rest of the presentation, I'll refer to that agency using its acronym, SAMHSA. And then the practitioner also needs to get a license from the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. And these practitioners are referred to as data waived practitioners. Once they have that special waiver and the license, they can prescribe buprenorphine to patients. So the second option practitioners have is to work at an opioid treatment program. At an opioid treatment program, they can administer the buprenorphine directly to patients. So just give the medication straight to them. And these are really highly regulated programs. SAMHSA requires them to provide counseling services to patients, limits the amount of medication that the programs can give a patient to take home, and just generally requires them to provide really careful oversight of patients. There are only roughly 1,500 of these programs in the entire country. And I just want to point out that these restrictions, exist only for the purposes of treating substance use disorder. So if a practitioner wanted to treat a patient for pain using buprenorphine, all they would need would be a normal license from DEA to prescribe a controlled substance. They wouldn't need to jump through any of these additional hoops. So this has really created a, two different systems where a patient can, pretty much go to any general practitioner and, for example, get a prescription for oxycodone. But if that patient wants to find a practitioner to treat opioid use disorder using buprenorphine, they might have a lot more trouble finding a practitioner because there's just not as many who are willing to jump through these hoops. And so whether a practitioner is a data wave practitioner or works in an opioid treatment program, they are prohibited from initiating buprenorphine treatment without first conducting an in-person medical exam of their patient. And I'll just be briefly a little more specific here because it will come up in a few minutes. So for the data wave practitioners, DEA regulations prohibit them from prescribing any controlled substance without first conducting an in-person physical exam. Buprenorphine is a Schedule III controlled substance, according to the DEA, so it falls under these restrictions. And these DEA regulations implement something called the Ryan Haight Act. So the Ryan Haight Act initially targeted rogue websites. People were essentially going online. They weren't having a real doctor's appointment. They were filling in a form, and then an online pharmacy would mail them a controlled substance. And this act was passed to really target, the ability to get a controlled substance without having a valid medical evaluation. And then for opioid treatment programs, on the other hand, for those practitioners, it's the SAMHSA regulations that really impact them. And SAMHSA requires those programs to conduct a physical exam before they admit a patient into the treatment program. All right, so you can move on to the next slide, please, Will. Thank you. So public health experts have argued for years that practitioners can conduct high quality care using telemedicine. But as I've just mentioned, federal regulations prohibit practitioners from initiating buprenorphine treatment without first conducting that in-person exam. But in response to the COVID-19 public health emergency, SAMHSA and DEA eased these restrictions. So each agency essentially released guidance saying that a firm could, that first exam could be done over the telephone or using an audio-visual connection. So they still have to do an in-person exam to initiate treatment, but it can be done using telemedicine. So these flexibilities really increase patient access to critical care, but they're set to lapse when the declared public health emergency is over. And so one of the big motivations behind this research is that DEA has said publicly that when the declared COVID-19 public health emergency is over, that telemedicine is going to return to the way it was before the pandemic. And DEA specifically argues it doesn't have the statutory authority to make these flexibilities permanent. These changes can only come from Congress. But in a report that my colleague, Professor Dooling, and I just released, where we conducted an independent assessment of whether DEA and SAMHSA do have the statutory authority to extend these flexibilities, we found that the agencies actually have multiple ways to extend the flexibilities. And I will move on to talking about those now. So first, DEA and SAMHSA could issue joint regulations allowing practitioners to prescribe buprenorphine without first conducting that in-person medical evaluation. Sorry, you can keep it on the last slide. Thanks. So when DEA issued the telemedicine flexibility in response to the COVID-19 public health emergency, DEA relied on a provision of the Ryan-Haight Act. So the Ryan-Haight Act has 7 telemedicine exceptions, which are essentially 7 instances where DEA can allow for that first exam to be done using telemedicine. So a declared public health emergency is one of those 7 instances. The Ryan-Haight Act also gives DEA another exception it can use here. So Congress said an instance where DEA can allow that first exam to be done using telemedicine is when it has issued joint regulations with SAMHSA allowing for that practice. So that statute really gives the agencies broad discretion to issue those regulations and say what is in those regulations. Now you can go to the next slide, Will, please. Thank you. And this is just an excerpt from the legislative history. The language of the statute is plain, so the legislative history is not controlling, but I just wanted to show how obvious it was that Congress really meant to give DEA broad authority to issue regulations that were going to allow for the full practice of telemedicine. And that's the quote from Congress, to allow for the full practice of telemedicine. So of course, if the agencies went this route, they would need to go through notice and comment rulemaking, which can take a year or longer. And the Biden administration has signaled it will likely extend the COVID-19 declared public health emergency through the end of 2021. So the flexibility should be protected for a year, but going the rulemaking route certainly takes significant time and resources. So the agencies would need to start working very soon. The joint regulations for prescribing buprenorphine and other controlled substances would be silent in regard to opioid treatment programs. So SAMHSA would need to issue a companion guidance document for the opioid treatment programs. And SAMHSA actually relied on its own regulatory authority as opposed to the authorizing statute to grant the exemption for opioid treatment programs during the pandemic. So it can rely on that same regulatory authority after the pandemic. All right, so the second potential path for DEA would be for it to establish a special registration for telemedicine program. So I've talked about 2 of the 7 telemedicine exceptions in the Ryan-Haight Act, a declared public health emergency, and when DEA and SAMHSA issue joint regulations. So here, the Ryan-Haight Act provides yet another relevant telemedicine exception the DEA could rely on. So under a special registration program, DEA would license practitioners to prescribe buprenorphine to a new patient using telemedicine. Coincidentally, recent legislation actually requires DEA to create a special registration program. Congress directed DEA to establish the program in 2018, and DEA has missed that initial deadline because they have not even proposed such a program. But DEA is still legally obligated to do this. Of course, the details matter, and whether a special registration program actually promotes telemedicine will depend on how it's designed by DEA. If it's particularly burdensome for practitioners to obtain this special registration, this license, it might not actually lead to an increased uptake in telemedicine. And under the second approach, just like the first, SAMHSA would need to issue a companion policy for opioid treatment programs. And then third and finally, SAMHSA and DEA could rely on the separate opioid-specific public health emergency declaration to extend these flexibilities. So both agencies pointed to, the COVID-19 public health emergency as the rationale for providing these flexibilities. And DEA specifically grounded its authority to extend the flexibility in the COVID-19 public health emergency. If the COVID-19, public health emergency is revoked or expired, the agencies could ground these flexibilities again in the opioid-specific public health emergency declaration. And this solution would offer a longer term, but not permanent way to extend these flexibilities. So I'll just wrap up by saying, as I mentioned, public health experts have argued for years that practitioners can provide high quality care using telemedicine. I think one of the things that the government got right during this COVID-19 pandemic was allowing people to begin buprenorphine treatment using telemedicine. And the opioid crisis has certainly not gone anywhere during this pandemic. And in fact, the pandemic has only made it worse. So we know drug deaths spiked during the pandemic. There were 88,000 drug overdose deaths in 2020. So promoting access to treatment during the pandemic was a no-brainer, but promoting access going forward is going to be particularly important. And so just last week, actually, the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy released its priorities for the next year. And one of the priorities is making these specific telemedicine flexibilities permanent. So what my co-author, Professor Dulling, and I found is that the executive branch can do this on its own without getting permission from Congress. All right,